Welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. And today I have a special guest. I have Megan Rose, PhD. She has a doctorate in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and a master's degree in religion and society from the Graduate Theological Union. She is an initiated ceremonial magician, Shakta tantric practitioner, and a senior seer in the House of Bree Fairy Seership Institute. She serves as an eco-spiritual minister and psycho-spiritual counselor and is the executive director of the Intheos Institute. So thanks a lot for doing the podcast. As I mentioned before we hit record, I'm reading your book and really enjoying it, and definitely recommend it to people out there. And so I want to start out with, I'm just interested, how did you personally get interested in the topic of spirit marriage, and how would you define spirit marriage?
Yeah. Well, I was, I like to say that I was sort of came out of the womb and was opened to the contact and the sort of embodied contact of otherworldly beings from a very early age. I was raised in the Pentecostal Christian tradition. And so speaking in tongues and laying on of hands and the sort of channeling of what, in that tradition they call the Holy Spirit, was just sort of an average, Wednesday night for me. And so, but, as I matured and became kind of disenchanted with the more fundamentalist forms of Christianity, I became really fascinated with embodied spirituality and what was going on in my body when I was having these sort of ecstatic experiences. So I went to school. I went to seminary at the Graduate Theological Union to really study religion and really study how religion shapes and forms and us as individuals and as, within cultures. And then, after studying religion for a number of years, I began to train as a holistic healing practitioner, and really putting those sort of embodied spiritual practices into good use as a healing arts practitioner, doing sort of integrative therapies, body work, energy healing, spiritual counseling, that kind of stuff. And along those lines, I was introduced to ceremonial magic and tantra. And it was sort of that thread that began to open me to more extraordinary intimacy with otherworldly beings. And I began to have sort of these intimate encounters. They were pleasant, but they were also sort of perplexing. And at one point, one of the contacts that I was having, this sort of spiritual the spirit lover phenomena, was happening mostly in my dreams. And then the spirit said, marry me. Will you marry me? And I was like, what? Like, what is that? What is that? Is that a thing? I mean, I knew about, from my religious studies background, I knew about, like the Genesis account, right? The sons of God, the angels marrying the humans and giving birth to the Nephilim. But I didn't think it was an actual thing that was still happening. I thought it was just sort of a mythological story or a sort of cosmological origin myth. And so I began to research it and really try to understand, what was the purpose of this? Who was the spirit, first of all, because it wasn't a clear, decisive contact. It shifted and changed a lot. And also why, like, what was the purpose of this? And what was going to be expected of me if I said yes? So that really launched me, that catapulted me into, back into my academic researcher role, and ended up going to do my PhD to really study this phenomena from a psychospiritual perspective, and did my PhD in psychology, really to try and understand not just historically how has this happened. I looked at the anthropological accounts, the mythological accounts, and the religious accounts, but also were people still doing this in this day and age?
Mhm.
And by the way, yeah. And why? And really, I was trying to understand why other folks were doing it so I could better understand what was happening with me. And so that's what I ended up doing. I researched it for about 10 years and did my PhD, my doctoral dissertation on spirit marriage. And then I turned it into the book that just came out in April. And the book is, part historical analysis, but really the heart of the book is all the interviews of other spirit and marriage practitioners that I collected. And then the last part is, okay, so now what? What do you do with all this? But spirit marriage, just to answer your question about what is it, it's
Mhm.
when a human steps into a bonded, committed, loving relationship with an otherworldly being. Um, and that I use the term spirit because it's just sort of the most broadest sense of what we could be talking about. But it's sort of an umbrella term for, or a shorthand for, deities, angels, elementals, fairy, beloved dead ancestors, really anything that isn't in a corporeal human form at this time.
Mhm.
So the category is really broad. Um, and then marriage is, again, it's sort of the best shorthand for understanding that you're committing to being in an ongoing relationship with this being that can sometimes be erotic, but isn't necessarily the hallmark of the relationship. It's more about the committed, co-creative relationship that
Mhm.
that you sign up for.
Okay, great. I'm just curious about your own personal experience. You had mentioned that this experience happened to you, and sort of the spirit reached out and wanted to get married with you, or sort of proposed this thing. Was this a result of were you doing like specific operations or specific like magical workings, or was it sort of more spontaneous, or like it just sort of randomly happened that you started working with the spirit?
It's a good question. It was sort of a both and. I was working ceremonial magic traditions. I was also experimenting with some of my own, conjure practices. Wasn't specifically calling in a spirit marriage, but I had done some sex magic work around calling in a spirit lover.
Mhm.
And had I think that I wasn't entirely aware. I know for a fact that I was not aware of the Babylon operation, which is
Mhm.
something that Parsons used to summon his angel through Marjorie Cameron. But I ended up sort of intuitively creating a ritual very similar to that for myself, which, and this was a little bit later on down the line once I had been proposed to by the spirit. But I had been reading. One of the things that I did do fairly early on was to create to use the rose cross to create a sigil for
Mhm.
the spirit, so that I had somewhat of a container that I could work with it within, and created an acrostic name that way. And that was, because that the nature of the spirit was somewhat fluid, and but I also relied really heavily on, like, Stan Groff talks about, who's a transpersonal psychologist. He talks about contact with these beings, and how they visually show up for us is less important than the somatic, how they feel to us, because the visuals are so unreliable. Even the sound can be fairly unreliable, and shift a lot. But I tended to go with, when I was having the same somatic response to the spirit, that was an indicator to me that it was the same being, even though it showed up in vastly different guises. And that's not uncommon for particularly for deity beings who have maybe an animal form and a human form and a a non-corporeal even kind of way that they're known. um and so there was was I working one specific tradition and one specific ritual? No, this was more feeling my way through what was arising from this very powerful contact that I had made, and was trying to sort of piece together the roadmap. One of the things that became really clear was that the contact seemed to be connected to my ancestral line, and particularly the women in my ancestral line. And that tradition, that those ancestors are mostly like Scots Irish,
Mhm.
and so and Welsh. And so I was sort of looking around for a teacher within those within that sort of, and also the through like the American South is sort of where those ancestors came from. So I was sort of looking around for a teacher that could help me connect to the contact through my ancestors, and that's how I landed in the fairy seership tradition, which is comes out of Scotland, but through the handed down from R.J. Stewart to my mentor Orion Foxwood, who is a Southern conjure worker out of Appalachia, but also carries the Scottish form of that as well. So that seemed to fit really well with my ancestors, and that was my opening, really, and my access point. A lot of that work.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, it seems like you took a very eclectic approach, and it didn't happen like linearly, but rather sort of non-linearly, sort of like putting different pieces of the puzzle together and um, coming from different perspectives and sort of figuring it out. So that sounds pretty
Yeah,
cool. That
very
sounds
very
cool.
much so. Yeah, I mean, because that it wasn't I mean, part of that I think also is just the nature um where I live. I live in a cosmopolitan city that has a very diverse population, and so as an eco-spiritual practitioner, I'm not only beholden to my ancestors, but also to like the spirits of place, to
Mhm.
the indigenous people, the first peoples that lived here before me, and to all of the various people that have lived in this city for the past, two 200 years or so. And so given that I was using the land, not using the land, but given that one of my access points was through the land, and particularly through trees, there's a very strong tree connection to my contact. um it was sort of like this round table of various um spirits and spiritual contexts, or spiritual technologies that I was having to address, right, and to
Mhm.
be in right relationship with.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm very curious. How is this different from this being spirit marriage? How is it different from channeling and possession? Because that's something that a lot of people have heard of, right? Like mediumship, channeling, possession. And are there any differences between what people call perhaps like a spirit contact, a guide, a familiar?
Yeah, I tend to think of it as maybe a later stage in the spirit contact, familiar spirit channeling spectrum.
Mhm.
The idea being that when you have a contact, that contact can maybe it maybe is stronger at times, or it recedes at other times, or channeling or mediumship, sort of have, or possessory experiences, you have a spirit come in and then leave, and there's this sort of delineation between you and the other. And with spirit marriage, and again, marriage is one of the words that I use. There are other words for it, and some of the other words for it are the indweller,
Hmm.
a merge, a symbiosis. So those all sort of hint to this idea that this deeper embeddedness has happened between the human and the otherworldly consciousness. And, as Orion Foxwood describes it, the two share a co-creative consciousness forthwith after that marriage or the ritual has happened. So it's a deeper commitment. It's a deeper bond, in that there is a kind of, well, the best way I can describe it is, Orion says, when he closes his eyes, he sees into his fairy wife's world. He's married to a fairy being in the very folkloric fairy rite marriage tradition. And he says, so when he closes his eyes, he sees into her world. And when he opens his eyes, she sees into his world. So there's this symbiosis of consciousness that is usually, happens in the marriage because that some byproduct, some co-creative project wants to happen between you and the spirit beloved, the spirit partner, that might not happen otherwise. And as far as, could it be a spirit that you had as a familiar spirit or tutelary spirit? Um, my research indicates yes. You could
Hmm.
have this spirit that is a companion for a while and then proposes marriage the deepening, because the deepening and the commitment that would facilitate is what's needed or requested of that relationship at that time. Kind of like you could have someone that you're a friend with for a really long time, and then you kind of like decide you want to deepen that relationship, and it might become romantic, it might become a deeper committed kind of structure or framework.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Um, so it's definitely more of a closer relationship, more symbiotic relationship, and as you mentioned, it could be it could be a familiar spirit you're working with that became sort of a deeper connection together as
Mm-hmm.
well. That's interesting. Okay. What's one cool thing about your book is that you explore so many different traditions, right? And so, in these like various countries and traditions and cultures that you studied and explored, I'm curious, what are some of the commonalities and perhaps like the most notable differences as well among these traditions and these spirit marriages that you studied?
Yeah. Well, I ended up interviewing 9 different people in 7 different traditions, and as you said, vastly different traditions as far as their geographic location, from, a Shakta tantric to a West African uh, uh, practitioner of the Dagara tradition out of Burkina Faso, West Africa, to Vodou practitioners from both Haiti and New Orleans, witchcraft practitioners, ceremonial magician, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, pretty much across the board, was the level of negotiation that these practitioners went through with their respective spirit spouses. So it wasn't like the spirit showed up, and also the fact that none of them really sought out a spirit marriage. It was always something that was, they were either invited into by or requested of them by the an elder in their community, or the spirit proposed to them. And so that was and that is sort of a hallmark of the spirit marriage practice traditionally, is that you don't necessarily go seeking one of these out. That being said, we can all woo and step into deeply loving devotional relationships with spirits and deities and whatnot. And so I don't think if you wanted to woo a divine being, a being that you were, badly in love with or wanting to deepen a relationship with, that would be, out of the realm of possibility.
Hmm.
It's more traditional, that, the spirit propose. In any event, the one of the interesting commonalities was this negotiation piece where they didn't just roll over and say, "Oh, you want to marry me? Okay. I'll give you everything. I'll do whatever you want." There was a lot of like boundary setting and some pushback and some I'm not ready yet. I will, negotiate around timing and I thought that was really inspiring because I think that in my case that's exactly what I did. The proposal happened and I didn't really say yes for probably almost 10 years.
Mm.
Um, because I was like, I don't know who you are. You aren't showing up consistently the same way. I need to figure out what this is that I would be saying yes to
Mm.
because it's not like, and honestly, for me, it's like, it's not all that different than getting to know a human partner. Like you want to know who you're getting involved with. You want to do your due diligence. And so that's what I did. But that was something that many of my co-researchers, the people that I interviewed, shared a similar kind of really setting boundaries.
Mhm.
What was different was kind of the protocol, right? If there was a very strong spirit marriage tradition within that spiritual system, for example, the Vodou traditions have something called the mariage loi, and that is readily practiced within those communities. And there's a protocol for it. There's expectations, and it very much mirrors a human marriage. In that the community is present. There's some special clothes that are worn. There's a cake usually, and rings
Mm.
are exchanged, and vows, and all of that. But in some of the other traditions, for example, the Shakta Tantric, when she married the goddess Kali,
Mm.
it was sort of just this done deal where she went into the temple one day and she had indications that it was probably coming,
Mhm.
portents, if you will, or we call them sort of tokens, things like she was decorated like a bride at this Mindy ceremony when she was there for another friend's wedding, and she thought that was odd. And then, maybe months, maybe it was like a year later, she went in to a temple to do a sadhana practice for Kali, and the priest that was there gave her a wedding sari, and the sort of marriage happened spontaneously. And then there's sort of the whole gamut in between. Like some of them involved community, and some of them were very personal, just between the individual and the spirit spouse. And it really varied according to how codified spirit marriage was already within that community's traditions.
Okay, very interesting. Something that came to mind while you're speaking on this, these relationships do seem very similar to how one would see like a human to human relationship too, right? Like their boundaries, sort of seeing like, is this a win-win or is this a hostile kind of thing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
one might need time to sort of evaluate whether this is the right fit, right? And know the person
Mm-hmm.
better or know the spirit better. So I'm curious, this came to mind while you're speaking. Is there also, or is it common, or did you come across a lot of spirit divorce as well, or breaking up with that spirit, or is that not wasn't as common?
It really depends on the nature of the spirit. For example, Orion Foxwood's marriage to the fairy Bree was a 7-year process that, he describes it as being rewired, um, psycho emotionally and physically as well. And he said, once that, because I ask everybody, that I interviewed, is their divorce, and he said that with, fairy beings, it's not really an option once you've gone through that level. And I should pause and say that fairy as we work with it within fairy seership, is not, we're not talking about um, fairies like Tinkerbell, right? We're not talking about sprites with wings. We're talking about primordial denizens of Earth before humans arose on the planet, much more akin to like J.R.R. Tolkien's elves. In fact,
Mm.
he based his elves in Lord of the Rings more on folkloric fairy um, tradition in many ways. And so these ancient primordial beings can, for the unprepared, and this is why it's often said that working with fairies is dangerous, because for the unprepared nervous system, it can be kind of like sticking your finger in a light socket, can really fry your circuits.
Mm.
Not unlike the way that folks in the tantric communities talk about Kundalini Shakti, right?
Hmm.
It's this lightning energy that is just can really unnerve and sort of unmake someone. And so the fairy marriage can take up to 7 to 9 years to achieve, and once it's done, it can't be undone. That being said, um, in the Washington witch doctor, so witchcraft practitioner Caroline that I interviewed, has divorced a spirit, and in her case, she's sort of a pantheist married to a variety of different spirits. So that's something that is possible as well, as this sort of polyamorous constellation of being married to more than one spirit being. And she is married to more than one spirit in cross pantheons. So in different, sometimes radically different traditions. And many of her spirit marriages happened sort of spontaneously, where the spirit appeared and said, I want to marry you. And Caroline, if she sort of knew the spirit, was like, okay, let's see where this goes. And in one case, she said that it wasn't going very well and she wasn't very pleased with how the spirit relationship was going. And so she sort of went before a spirit a deity who had sort of governance over the spirit that she was married to, and asked for a divorce and was granted it. So it's not, unheard of. But what I like to encourage people is to really know who you're getting involved with before you give up before you make that level of commitment. Make sure that you're working with a spirit, deity, angel, whatever, that like, and trust, that has given you its name, and that you have developed a relationship with, because we bring things to the relationship.
Hmm.
It's not just about, oh, holy being out there that I'm a supplicant to. It's actually standing in our sovereignty as as a human, and knowing that there are things that we can do that they can't, and there are things that they do that we can't, and that together we can actually create something really, really wonderful.
Yeah, it's excellent. There are so many examples in your book of different spirit marriages, but I was wondering if you can kind of share a little bit more details about maybe one of those cases, and things along the lines of like, how did that process occur? How did the spirit marriage occur? And what was the nature of the relationship? And how did that sort of change that person?
Mm. Well, one of the stories that I love is the story of Madrone, and she is the West African shrine keeper. Um, and she was a practitioner of the Dagara tradition, which comes out of Burkina Faso, West Africa. And her human husband is also a practitioner. And they were students of Dr. Malidoma Some, who some folks may have heard of, who brought his tradition from West Africa here to the United States and established communities both on the East and the West Coast. And Madrone and her husband are part of the West Coast community. And her husband is in spirit marriages with certain spirits in that pantheon. And he needed to establish some shrines that couldn't, in the way that their spiritual technologies work, those shrines that he needed and the work that he needed to do couldn't be established until this one shrine, which is called the Tingan Shrine, was established for the community. Because all of the rituals and the workings and the spiritual tradition of Dagara land is done within community. It's within a group and a community of people. And so he and Malidoma were talking about, we need to establish this Tingan shrine. Who's going to be the shrine keeper for this Tingan shrine? And Tingan is the masculine energy of Earth that governs abundance and stability and finance and contracts and things like that, and is established through a tree. There's a tree that is installed as the shrine, and then the spirit sort of moves and breathes through this tree for the community. And they were sort of scratching their chins, and they're like, who would be a good fit to be the spirit, companion, the spirit spouse for Tingan and be the shrine keeper? And Malindoma said, oh my gosh, you know who it is? It's your wife. It's Madrone. She is the perfect, because her mundane job out in the world is she's a financial planner, and she already had a really strong relationship with trees. And so Malidoma asked her to marry Tingan, and she, was kind of like, oh my goodness, this is, sort of like an arranged marriage. But she said, it really made sense. And so that's what happened. Is she married Tingan, and the whole community, they did this whole ritual with the community there, and she took vows, and it was this really beautiful ceremony as she described it, and very moving, because that she was doing it in service to the community, to the furthering of her husband's spiritual practice, and just this really beautiful way in which she really understood that she was furthering her work as a financial advisor in the world by now being this anchor point for this spirit that would serve in a new capacity the many of the things that she was already doing.
That's very interesting. One thing that came to mind while reading your book and listening to your stories is that oftentimes some of these people, they also have like an earthly spouse, right? Like a husband or wife,
Mm-hmm.
on top
Mm-hmm.
of having a spirit consort, spirit marriage. Is there ever any like conflict along those lines, or is that not seen? I'm just wondering, is like does one or the other get jealous? I mean, I could see human beings getting jealous. I'm curious if there's like jealousy on the other end, you know?
Well, it really helps if your human partner, like Madrone's, is in the tradition that you're working, or at least is, understands that you're working in this framework of this particular spiritual technology. And negotiation, again, right, is a big piece of this. I talk about in the Haitian Vaudou song chapter about Monique and her husband, who she's a Mambo and he's an Ungan, and between the two of them, they're married to a handful of different Loa, which are the deities in that tradition. And they had to negotiate, because then in their tradition, you are supposed to spend anywhere from 1 or 2 nights a month to 1 night a week with the different spirits the different Lua that you're married to, because each has a specific day that is sacred to them. And she said they sat down and did the math, and if she were spending 1 night a week with her spirit spouses, and he was, with each of them on their different nights, and he was, they would never sleep in the same bed together.
Mm-hmm.
And so they negotiated with the spirits and with each other, so that they have maybe like a few nights a month that's set aside for the spirits, and then they're able to be in their marital bed the rest of the month. So So that was, it can be complex if you have, you know, uh no contact, if your partner has no contact or if they have a lot of contact. But I'm also thinking of Orion's story where he shared that he was in a long-term relationship. He's gay, so he was in a long-term relationship with his partner, who uh had been with him while he was setting up his coven on the East Coast, and had been with him while he was serving, starting uh, addiction recovery programs for the government. And then when Bree showed up and asked to marry Orion, it was sort of the beginning of the end of his relationship with his partner, because his partner was just, felt like that he had shared Orion with the government and he shared him with his coven. And now he was going to have to share him with this spirit that was inside of him that could never be extricated from him. And it was ended up being kind of too much.
Mm.
Interestingly, though, not long after that, Orion met his current fiance, who they've been together, and he's never known Orion without Bree. And so, um, and in his case, he's also a spirit worker as well. And so, yeah, so it takes a certain sort of relationship, a certain sort of person, but it really helps if we find, if our human partners um, are tolerant of and aware of our sort of um, out of the box spirituality and out of the box sexuality, right? Because this is
Hmm.
a very spiritu intimate. This is sometimes called spiritu intimacy, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, in terms of as you mentioned, like in spirit marriage, there are sexual aspects to it too, right?
There can be, yeah.
There can be. So like you were saying, like definitely, I mean, I could see, as you mentioned in the first case of Orion's first partner. I mean, I could understand somebody being jealous, especially if they didn't understand the nature of these relationships and they're not sort of within these traditions, right? And as you mentioned earlier, like in the other example, if it's part of your community or part of your tradition, it's definitely much easier to understand. But it seems sort of like a challenge could be finding somebody who is maybe not in these traditions or not a part of these practices, uh, sort of getting them to understand what's going on.
Yeah. And then
Hmm.
the question of like, how much do you want to disclose with potential new partners,
Hmm.
and how do you, how do you, so in my case, when this started happening for me, um, I had a, I was in a fairly new relationship. Um, but the first contact started happening um before I had met my partner at the time. And it was almost like this sort of synchronous thing.
Hmm.
uh but it never, I mean, in my case, my contact almost always happened when I was in my dream
Hmm.
space. And so it never really detracted or took away from my human relationships. It, if anything, sort of expanded and enhanced and really set the course of what we would study together. So,
Hmm.
my partner at the time, when the relationship was emerging, he and I studied ceremonial magic and initiated into ceremonial magic tradition together, because that was sort of precipitated by this spirit lover that I had. And then later on, um the doing the Babylon ritual,
Hmm.
or my version of that, right? um was what called to me my current partner, who actually aspects or has a very strong resonance with my spirit beloved. So that's an interesting aspect of this, that um sometimes, particularly people who are unpartnered but have a with a human partner but have a spirit beloved that's wooing them, there is this way in which, kind of like with what Jack Parsons did, where you can invite the spirit to bring a person into your life that is a host or a kind of in alignment
Hmm.
with that spirit beloved, right? So we all have these divine selves that are sort of rarefied aspects of our mundane self, and um, that we can host, right? That we can express. And you see this really clearly in the tantric traditions with the deity yoga practices, right? Where you're seeing the divine in your beloved, your human beloved, and they might even sort of, that divine being might even come and move forward into them as you host your divine being, and then there's this sort of beautiful merging and mingling of that with through a sort of sacred sexual lens. And so there are ways in which we can summon or invite. I prefer the invitation rather than the demand, right? So we can invite the divine, that, or the spirit beloved that we're in this relationship with, to bring people or a person into our life that hosts that energy and allows us to deepen both in the physical and in the spiritual. And so that's what happened for me when my current partner showed up. I had done this ritual, and within about, I don't even think it might have been 6 months,
Hmm.
maybe, probably more like 3, that he showed up very demonstrably, presencing this spirit beloved that I was working with, and that was remarkable and challenging, and uh, because just because somebody's hosting a divine energy, or your spirit beloved, doesn't mean that they are that 100% of the time, right?
Right.
And so then there's coming to terms with all of the mundane human stuff.
Sure, sure. That makes absolute sense. I think some people are probably listening to this and they're very curious about this, and they might be thinking, like, what are the benefits? What are the pitfalls of undergoing a spirit marriage? So, since you have experience and a vast amount of study on this, I'm kind of curious, what are some of the maybe personal benefits or benefits that you've noticed with other people, and then maybe some of the pitfalls or some of the things that people should watch out for?
Yeah, I think that the benefits are um this enlivenment, this vitalization that can happen, um, particularly with our uh, physical body. I went through a whole sort of recalibration process, which really refined um, a lot of my extraordinary perception. Like, so one of the byproducts, one of the folkloric byproducts, in fact, of the human spirit marriage is an expanded capacity. As sometimes that expanded capacity is eloquence, sometimes it's charismata, extraordinary perception, prophecy, like ESP, prophecy, poetry,
Mhm.
creativity. And you look at the historical and the folkloric accounts, and I'm thinking right now of Thomas the Rhymer, who was a actual laird in Scotland, and I think 12th, 13th century, also known as Thomas of Ercildoune. And his fairy marriage, the byproduct of that was that he wrote all of these prophecies, and was renowned at that time. I mean, this is a historical figure who was renowned for his prophetic capability, as well as his eloquence and his poetry. And so that is often a gift. A byproduct is these sort of expanded human, um, beyond just the mundane human senses, the sort of extrasensory capacities. As for pitfalls, I mean, I think that it, I talk about sort of um, the three things that you sort of want to be aware of and watch out for are, like spiritual bypassing. Oh, I've married this spirit, and therefore, I am so evolved and so awake, so woke, and so beyond the beyond, so
Yeah.
self-aggrandizement, right? You have to be really careful that you're realizing that, like, yes, you may have this special extraordinary relationship, but there's a lot of other people out there that do as well.
Mhm.
And comparing yourself to others, well, I've got this spirit marriage, so that makes me special. um and just staying really humble, right? Really like humble. I love the word humble because the root of that is humus, which is like earth, like staying really grounded, right? So one of the things that can happen as a byproduct of any extraordinary contact is we become very ungrounded, right? We become very sort of like up in the ethers, and
Mhm.
depending on the spirit that you're working with. But the point is to be in your body and fully embodied, right? That's sort of the sweet spot with this, is how do I have expand into this but also really bring it down into a rooted, grounded, embodied practice, because that's where we shape and change and form things, is here in the physical.
Mhm. Oh, great. Okay. One term that I came across that I was unfamiliar with personally is entheosis. So maybe you can explain to the audience and me what is entheosis and how does this relate to spirit marriage?
Yeah, so the root of entheosis is entheos, which means the divine within.
Mm.
And entheosis is a sort of an older term in mostly the Christian tradition, that I'm sort of dusting off and reclaiming and talking about, that we each have, as I said, a divine self that is actionable, right? That we can step into relationship with and get to know, like, trust, love, and perhaps even marry. So marry in the sense that we step into deep union and deep, what the ceremonial magicians call knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel.
Mhm.
And the holy guardian angel, there's lots of different ways we can grok that, but I think of that and the divine self as sort of same.
Mhm.
And so, like I said, that traditionally with spirit marriage, the spirit is inviting us into the marriage. And that may not be the case for everybody, right? Not everybody has a spirit that's ringing their doorbell saying, I want to marry you. But each of us has a divine self, right? Each of us has this divine self, Matet, holy guardian angel, Ishtadevi. There's lots of different terms for this concept of a being that is infinitely wise and loving, beyond just our higher self, but this like divine presence that is an intelligence that we are an expression of, or we're here to be an expression of. We have the potential to express, and we can all reach to that. We can all woo that part of us forward. We can all find that devotional relationship, and that is the process of entheosis. It is the art of awakening the divine within, and really knowing and loving and conversing with that part of ourselves, to the point where maybe we just start flowing that energy, right, as who we are, right, and as how we show up more and
Mhm.
more.
Okay, interesting. For some listeners that are listening to this, they might be interested in, taking part in a spirit marriage or wondering how would one engage in this process, because it sounded like you mentioned earlier that a lot of the case studies, they sort of, it wasn't necessarily that the person was seeking that, but it was either part of the tradition or um, the spirit sort of contacted them and initiated it, right? So are there
Mhm.
any ways that a human, could you work with, different operations, or like kind of like you were saying earlier in your experience, like you can do certain practices that would open the doors for, such contact and such potential relationship happening?
Yes. So I give a series of practices in the third part of the book, which is like, okay, so you've learned about spirit marriage, and now what? What do you want to do with it? Do you want to do anything with it? So there are some practices in the book, and then I offer a spirit marriage 101 self-study course where you can learn about spirit marriage and begin to learn practices and tools and rituals um, for stepping into that kind of relationship. And really, what I encourage people to do, the first thing is to really find a devotional being or a devotional deity. I like to encourage people to work with deity just because that there are typically built up forms that have been kind of vetted, and there's that sort of know, like, and trust factor with them. But certainly, along the lines of the knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, it isn't necessarily just a codified deity form that you could be working with. To find one's angel is, akin to sort of like finding a needle in a haystack. It could be a myriad of different forms or ways in which that presents. Um, but in any event, I encourage people to, self excavate. So, sort of look at your own personal story, look at what are the myths or even the fairy tales that you've been drawn to throughout your life. Look at what my one of my teachers, Dr. Craig Chalquist, talks about. What is the mythological archetype that you have been living into in your life? You know,
Mhm.
um, and that might give you sort of this breadcrumb trail that you follow to find the the being, the deity, the divine form that you might want to woo, might want to date a little bit and get to know.
Yeah, great, great. Yeah, I'm really enjoying your book so far. As I mentioned, it's a very long book, but it's very interesting. What I personally enjoy about it is that you draw on so many different cases and traditions. It's as you mentioned, you put in tips at the end. I'm not on that part yet, but there's sort of practical aspects to it, academic aspects to it, just fun, entertaining aspects to it. So a lot of books you might read on similar topics could be either very dry and academic, right? Where it's sort of, it's interesting, but it's not necessarily interesting to read, if that makes sense, right? So
Mm-hmm.
yours is really interesting because it combines so many different. It's very, it's like a living book. It's very diverse, and at the same time, rooted or rooted in like academic study and like professional in that regard, right? It's not just like a random, uh, it's not like you're just journaling whatever, right? So
Right,
yeah, so I
right.
really enjoyed that aspect of it. But I'm curious, do you have any upcoming projects or books or any other events or anything along those lines? And then also, how can people who are listening to this personally find you, reach out to you, like that?
Yeah. So I have my Spirit Marriage 101 self-study course, which is just ongoing. Enroll, go at your own pace whenever you want. And that's available on my website, which is Dr. Megan Rose, Meganrose, with a DR in front, drmeganrose.com. And I also have a group program. And when you sign up for the self-study course, you get a free month in my group program with other spirit marriage practitioners. So these are people who have spirit marriages or are in the process of stepping into one. And I really feel strongly that this practice is something that is best done with a community of understanding and compassionate folks around you, because that it's such an edgy topic, and it's such a sort of a new thing that it can easily become kind of ungrounding. And so I have, curated a group of folks from my various students and clients and whatnot in this small group program. And then I will be teaching a course this fall through Cherry Hill Seminary on the Dark Goddess, who is one of my devotional deities and one of my deep bonded relationships. So that'll be in November, and you can go to cherryhillseminary.org, I believe it is, to enroll in that course. And that's just a 4-week course that will meet and explore the topic of the Dark Goddess.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I think it's cool that you're offering this sort of community, well, the course too, but also the community, because as you mentioned, in a lot of your stories and case studies, the community aspect is such a foundation or backbone of it too, right? Whereas in sort of the Western, what would you say, individualistic world, I often feel that people are isolated or cut off from that sense of community, right? They have sort of more of an
Yep.
individualistic outlook. So that was one interesting thing I mentioned. I was just in the Bay Area, or in California. And going to America and Asia, it's such a different dynamic, right? Because in Asia, it's a group culture, it's a group dynamic, everything's about the relationships, right? Whereas in America,
Yep.
everyone's sort of doing their own thing, and for better or for worse, right? They have pros and
Yeah.
cons. But
Yeah.
in this particular case with spirit marriage, it seems like having that community and people to talk to and sort of support and to share your experiences is something that I think would be very important if one were taking these practices on on their own and sort of questioning themselves, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's not a typical thing. You don't go to you don't go to the coffee shop and talk about your spirit marriage unless it's
Right.
somebody so it's sort of out of the ordinary, out of the mundane, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. One of my co-researchers, the Shakti Tantric Kamadevi, says we either all get there together or we don't get there at all. And that's the philosophy in the tantric community in the Kula. And so what I really have tried to do, and I should pause and say, I do have a free online group that is on Facebook, and it's called Spirit Marriage Discussion Group, that anybody can join, so that it's not just my private paid group, which is way more high touch, and I do a lot of teachings, and we really have a deep intimacy within the group of practitioners. But there's also this sort of discussion group that I've got. It's on Facebook. But in any event, the idea that community plays this really key role was really at the heart of my practice and my offerings, because um, like in my case, I didn't have a community for a very long time,
Mhm.
and certainly not a community of spirit and marriage practitioners. Um, and what I was being pulled into was not situated in one specific tradition.
Mm.
There were a few different pieces that were moving around. Um, you know, and I was trying to figure out, if you're called by a Loa into the Vodou tradition, there's a very strong practice and community support and understanding of how to take you through that process. But in my case, that wasn't what I was being called into, and many of my students and clients are being pulled into relationships with entities with spirits that don't have a specific tradition that they align to. And so I really wanted to create a culture and a community for those people, and also for people who might be pulled into something and they are trying to understand the beginning of it, and then they might actually want to deepen with a tantric path, or deepen with a Vodou path, or deepen with a fairy seership, and then I can point them in the direction of, here's the path that I can send them on to another teacher, right? So they can kind
Hmm.
of come to me and get the foundations laid, and then deep dive
Hmm.
with one of these other traditions that are out there. And as a religious studies scholar, that's what I've kind of always done, is looked comparatively at and cross culturally at different religious traditions and practices.
Yeah, so you're like the human guide to the spirit world. In other words, yeah.
Or
So
the spirit marriage world, maybe. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Oh, very good. I really enjoyed this conversation, and definitely going to keep reading your book. Really enjoying that as well. And as you mentioned, you have a Facebook group. Can people reach out to you on Facebook and Instagram, or what's the best way to get in touch as well? Via your website as well, right?
Yeah, they can reach out to me on my website. If they do via my website, I have some freebies on there that you can sign up and get a three keys to spirit marriage, and also on my contact form on my website. That's probably the best way to reach me. I have a presence on Instagram, Dr. Megan Rose, and on Facebook. But as far as reaching out and getting like a live response, unless you join the group and you're commenting, and then I might be commenting back, but contact me on my through my website is probably the best way.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll include all the links in the show notes to your website, social media, as well as your book as well. And so, thanks a lot for coming on, and until next time.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.